Good evening and welcome to the Northern Kentucky Forum. The Northern Kentucky Forum is a partnership between NKU and the three libraries in Kenton, Campbell, and Boone County. The goal of the Northern Kentucky Forum is to bring groups together for civil conversations around challenging topics, which tonight we will be doing. I have the pleasure of introducing Hillary Delaney from Boone County Libraries to talk a little bit about why we're here tonight and a little bit about the film.
Hi, thanks everybody for being here, and thank you if you are joining from home. I am thankful for the Northern Kentucky Forum for helping us make this happen, and to NKU for this beautiful facility. Um, as Shauna said, I work at the Boone County Public Library's Archive and History Center. I began researching Underground Railroad history in Boone County about 11 years ago. And from that sprung other African American history initiatives when I realized that the history of our county, Black history, was almost completely omitted. And of course, there are pieces of that history, most of it, in fact, that are not easy to have conversations about, but they need to be brought to the forefront so that we can heal those things and share in those things and understand them and understand each other a little bit better as a result. The film that we are screening tonight does not take place in Boone County, and you may be scratching your head wondering why. And our panelists that will be here for the Q&A afterwards will help us kind of unpack all of this. But there were 7 lynchings in Boone County. And that history is largely unknown because it is so uncomfortable, but also it is not present in the county narrative and has not been present in terms of what the county history is as it's told until recently. So this is sort of helping us as a community understand those things through another community's experience. So stick around afterwards and we will talk to the panelists, and you can ask questions and we can talk about what we've just seen. And I also want to thank WKU's PBS for providing this film to us to use. So I will, without further ado, we can get started with the film. Thank you.
I think people have slowly come to the fact that you need to tell these stories. I always promised Miss Maribel. She said, if I give you this Bible, you got to promise me you'll tell this story. Knew Miss Maribel as a kid, because her and my grandmother grew up down in Armstead. And Miss Maribel got sick. They thought she was going to die. And they sold her house, they sold her car, they sold her furniture. All they didn't sell was her books and papers and pictures and stuff like that. They boxed that up. After she pulled through, they got her a house up on 6th Street up on this, and wasn't no more than a block from us, so they had these boxes, some pictures and stuff, like personal stuff. I was helping them put books up, and in this one box was this Bible, and it just fell to this page. And it had these 4 men that got killed on the same day. And I said, Miss Maribel, what happened to them? Did they burn up in a fire or something? She said, no, boy, they were lynched. I said, Miss Maribel, what's lynched? My grandmother said, leave Maribel alone. You just meddle all damn time. Just leave Maribel alone. And that ended it that day, but I got back up there and talking to Miss Mattie Bell and talking to Miss Mattie Bell. But that's where I got started on Rufus Browder. And the funniest thing about it, the Bible never mentioned Rufus Browder, it just mentioned these 4 guys that got lynched. Rufus Browder was a young man who was born down in the arms to Fletcher Browder. And Rufus's family lived down the road from Cunningham. And Rufus had went to work as a farmhand. Now, Cunningham didn't own the farm. He was just the overseer of the farm. The farm belonged to Dr. Jesse Russell. Cunningham's wife's family owned some of Rufus's family during slavery. Browder worked for Cunningham for about a year until one day they got in an argument over wages.
When slavery ended, 1865, 1866, for a lot of the ex-slaves, many of them stayed in the very same communities. Again, that was home for them, where they had been slaves. And so that meant, in most of these instances, working out relationships with the very people who had owned them.
That was a real fear and a real problem after the Civil War, or perceived to be a potential problem, was controlling black labor. How can we extract that labor when they're free and they're not forced to work for us? So there are a variety of tactics that were used to keep blacks on plantations, things like sharecropping and crop lien systems, or this debt peonage that after buying tools or having to take loans from different store owners to buy tools, or from the landowner for things like and animals, that even after working the entire year, they still don't have enough to pay off these debts for these things from the profits that they make through agriculture. So those are more kind of coercive tactics, kind of from slave owner to employer. So still controlling labor, but different types and different manifestations of that.
By and large, it meant that they would be working for their ex-slave owners. And then under other circumstances where the landowner was taking advantage of them and also had the power structure to back that up, it meant that these people would be mired in a situation where it would be very difficult for them to ever get out of.
A lot of them never severed their connections. A lot of people's connections with the slave people existed after slavery on up until the early 1900s. You know, what were you going to do? You know, eventually when slavery was over and you're free, but with that freedom, what did you get besides freedom? You still had to eat, you still had to live, you still had to have shelter. So a lot of people just went to work for the people who they were slaves for, and stayed there a few more generations. This has always been my home. My family was always down there. It's always been my home. But it was rough. And it wasn't only rough on us, it was rough on just about everybody down here. There wasn't a whole bunch of people down here had no money. Most of the people down here were poor A lot of them were uneducated. Most of the people here were maids or farm workers or something like that. They didn't have a whole lot. Like I said, it was rough on us, but it was a nice community. It was good. And then at night you had your joints, you know. At night it would fill up with just cars everywhere. And I lived across the street with my grandmother when I was younger, so she would go to sleep and I would cross my legs, get on this table and just look out the door and watch all these people everywhere. And I tell somebody it looked like the building next door used to be over, it looked like it was swelling. Be people everywhere. I'm kind of embarrassed, but it was so funny. One night, the guy, he had hired me and this guy to work the door right here at a little like a disco. Because back in late 70s and early 80s, you had these discos. So he hired us to work the door. He gave us $25 in ones. And we were working the door and people coming in. Well, I knew I couldn't count, but I was thinking that the other guy he hired could count, so it would cover for me not being able to count. And people coming in, oh, it was crowded, people everywhere. The place was full. So he come and asked for the money. I think we gave him about $20. He said, "Where's the money at?" And we looked at each other, and this guy had come told him, I didn't realize till years later that the guy had come told him that we couldn't count. We were giving away, people giving us 20, and we giving $30 and stuff. And he looked at us, he said, "Y'all can't count. So that means you can't read. What the hell is going on here?" And after it was over, I was feeling so bad. I guess he tried to cheer me up. He said, "Well, if you can't read, you can learn how to read." He gave me a book, and I ain't never forgot it. It was called The Spook Who Sat by the Door, and a dictionary. And he said, "Take this and read it, and what you don't understand, you can holler at me about." The guy who owned the building found out about it, and I guess they just figured that I worked good enough cleaning up and doing around that they'd keep me and let me work and learn as I go. And I would just sit back in the kitchen with a dictionary and read. So I kind of taught myself how to read. I like history, so I read about history, government, law. Pretty much all I read, history, government, and law. Well, the history of Logan County is where I first went, the little blue book. And when Kaufman done that history, he mentions the lynching, and he mentions Rufus Browder. And that's kind of where I found out about that at. And then I just slowly started putting stuff together. There were sharecroppers, but I don't think Rufus then were necessarily sharecroppers, as they were day laborers. And the day laborer would go work for a certain person in the daytime and get paid a certain amount. One day they got to arguing over wages. Rufus wanted to get off, he said, to go to Allenville, which was probably 10, 12 miles from where the farm was, to get some medicine for his wife. And Cunningham at first told him it was all right, but then he came back later on and told him he wanted to work till 5. Rufus told him if he waited till 5, he'd miss the train to get to Allensville. And Cunningham told Rufus if he left before 5, he would dock his pay. It would have been a lot for someone at that time period, and Rufus's argument is that you're gonna dock me a quarter, but I ain't making a quarter. So you're gonna dock me more than what I'm making. So Rufus ended up leaving before 5, I think, and got the medicine. He stopped off in, I think it was Monroe Townsend's for a frolic, as they called it, which was probably a modern day party, barn dance or something. And he stayed there and he came home. This was probably Friday.
We see throughout history, whether you're talking about the era of enslavement or the era of Jim Crow, lots of acts of individual resistance by Black Americans to what they deemed to be white oppression and the overseer's desire to dock Rufus more than a day's pay as a punitive measure is a really great example of this. I mean, his request is very reasonable. It's certainly anything a reasonable person can understand. His wife is sick, she needs medicine. But he is told, as a way to control him, that he can't do it, and he's given this incredibly punitive measure. So we don't know the rest of the employment history. There are so many things about this story that we don't know. We don't know what the long-term relationship between these two men is, but whatever it was, this is the moment where Rufus Browder says, I have to resist this. Perhaps it is to save his wife's life. Maybe he does think it's in danger, or maybe he's had it. Maybe he's done. And this is the moment that he chooses to resist, whether consciously or unconsciously. And he walks out. And this is the moment when the white overseer knows that he's overplayed his hand and it didn't work. And what happens next? So he has to do something. If he doesn't do something, then his Black employee will have gotten away with it and the power dynamic shifts. So that's really what's at stake here. And that's what's at stake in many situations where it escalates to violence. The idea that resistance leads to another action.
Monday morning when he got up, he seen Cunningham, and he said he was putting a buggy in the buggy house. And he went out and talked to Cunningham. What exactly went on, nobody really knows. Browder's the only one lived to tell about it, and he said Cunningham had told him that if his wife wasn't sick, he would put him off the farm. Then Cunningham asked Rufus, do you know where he's staying? And I think Rufus said, yeah, you owe me about 50 cents a quart or something like that. He said, yeah, that's right. And then that was the end of it. Rufus went back to his cabin, which was behind Cunningham's house, and Cunningham stayed working in the little buggy house. Rufus came out of the house and went back to the buggy house, and Cunningham told him again that if his wife wasn't so sick, I'd put you... No, he said, I'm gonna call the doctor and see how your wife is doing, and if she's all right, I want you to get off the place. And Rufus said, don't. You have 30 days or something to get off. And Cunningham told Rufus that he didn't care about that because he didn't like his darn way of doing things, something like that. And Rufus said, well, hell, I don't like your darn way of doing things. Rufus said, because Rufus was the only person living, that Cunningham hit him with a hitch ring, and then they both drew their pistols and shot each other. After that happened, Rufus ran to his father's house and hid, and Cunningham fell in the road and died.
There comes a point where a person can say, enough, that this is unfair. My understanding is that Rufus Browder had reached that point and was ready to then no longer remain in that relationship. Cunningham, of the records I read, said, hit him with a whip. Okay, so if you hit someone with a whip, and eventually you go to doctors, that can be documented. Okay, that alone, if Browder had been white, would have justified him shooting and killing Cunningham. That alone would have been enough. But it did not end there. Again, In Louisville, they do know that he has a wound that has to be addressed. So he has been shot. So that means what more? He's been hit with a whip. He's been shot. That is more than enough by the laws of American society for whatever action Rufus Browder takes. Rufus Browder, then fearing for his life, and let's say frankly, probably fed up with all of this, who wouldn't be, he then shoots back and he kills Cunningham.
Running is the only thing that Rufus Browder can do, because he is a black man who has just shot a white man who is his employer. And he knows that no matter what happens to him, whether it's a lynch mob or it's an all-white jury, he's not going to be acquitted, and they're not going to see this as self-defense. And he knows that. I mean, rationally and emotionally, he knows that. So of course he runs. It's the only logical decision.
This is Armstrong, Kentucky, southern part of Kentucky, in 1908. Logan County, by 1908, they had about probably 8 or 10 lynchings. It was a smart thing to do, because if they catch you, not the law, but the people, if they catch you, more than likely they're gonna kill you. You have killed a white man. This is taboo. So the smart thing was to hide, if you want your life, even though you are right. The neighborhoods all start coming to Cunningham's house. Once they find out what had went on, they start forming little groups and posses to go out and look for Rufus, to arrest him. I think Judge Edwards got the call about 6 or 6:30 that morning. Then he called Sheriff Tom Ray, and Ray called his deputy O'Connell, and they took a train down to Allensville, and then from Allensville they rented a buggy and they went to the Cunningham's house. When they got there, they found out about the murder and what all had happened, and that there were people out looking for Rufus.
Rufus Browder had to understand the racial dynamics of that day, and he has now killed this man. And that alone causes him a problem. And so I can understand his fleeing, because he realizes he's now put himself in great risk. But I think his fleeing does not mean, and I would think most, at least African Americans back then, would have understood his fleeing does not mean that he's guilty. Again, there are two things that would document that something had happened. Cunningham could not have shot him after he was already dead in that regard, and the hitting him with the whip. It would be very difficult to hit him with the whip after he's been shot. So it shows that Cunningham was involved in that regard, even if you somehow concocted it to say where Browder had been the aggressor in that regard. But it still would have meant they had a confrontation, and when something like that happens, at the very least, surely that's self-defense, justifiable homicide, or something other than just plain murder.
So the sheriff went to Fletcher Browder, who was Rufus's father's house, to see if he could find him. And when he got there, there were some blacks standing around. They searched all the blacks. They didn't find any weapons on them. They just found cartridges. Then they later, after they searched them, they went in and searched the house and found 2 or 3 pistols, and they confiscated them. When Sheriff Ray came out, he left guards there at Fletcher's house. So he left and he went, I think he went toward they call it John Paul's store or something like that. And he was planning on getting some lunch. Before he got there, though, he stopped at this creek. And at this creek, these men start coming up in squads, 4 or 5 armed men in each squad. And Fletcher walked up, and him and Fletcher had a talk, and he told Fletcher that he needed to get Rufus to turn himself in. Fletcher told him that Rufus had went to Tennessee, and sure, it'd be the next day before he could get his hands on him. And Fletcher told him that he was worried that all these armed men would harm his son. And Sheriff Ray, he told him he would guarantee that he would protect them. And he also told the armed men that if they didn't bother Rufus, he could probably get him arrested, and that if they did try to harm him, he would probably let him go.
He wants to find him first because he knows that once one of those vigilante groups gets hold of him, then he has absolutely no chance. And there will be no due process of law. There will be no trial. There will be nothing but a murder, but a lynching. And the sheriff knows that. But the sheriff also knows that if he actively tries to stop them from doing this, then he too will be murdered. He may not be lynched in that it won't be a public spectacle, but he will absolutely be murdered. His bailiffs, his jail staff, they could all be murdered.
Fletcher eventually left, and Tom Ray left to go to the poor store from the creek. As he got to the poor house, he got a call from the Cunningham house telling him to come back, that Fletcher was going to take him to get Rufus. And he went back to the Cunningham house with Fletcher, and Fletcher took him back close to his house to get Rufus, and they found Rufus in a sinkhole, and that's how they arrested him. And they asked him one question: has anybody been here to help you? He told them, my brother-in-law, John Boyer, has been here telling me what was going on about the house. And that's very important when you look at what ended up happening later. I tell people, it's kind of funny how I got involved. I got to argue with 2 preachers about this place. We were over across at the KP under the tree, and we had a conversation. They told me my place was the cause of all the drug problems in this area. And I explained to them that my place wasn't the cause of it. It was those kids outside of the place, and that I could not enforce or stop them from selling drugs because I wasn't an officer of the law. I was a business owner in the community. It wasn't right to try to force me to stop them when I didn't have that authority. So we got to arguing, and I told them I was going to close up, and I locked it up. And I went home, dumb me, forgot that that's how I made my living. And after that, I got kind of depressed, and I went home and laid down. I tell people when I laid down, I weighed 172 pounds, 180 pounds. When I got back up, I weighed 280 pounds. And this guy who actually ran this, he was the guy that I came to work here under when I was a teenager. He came to the house one day. He said, they're trying to start a black museum here, and they want you to help them. Because I had collected all this stuff about the neighborhood and stuff, people had gave me a lot of stuff. Plus, I love history, and I'd done a lot, studied black history. I had wrote articles for the paper about black history, so they Just asked me to be involved. And he said, well, they said they want you to help them. And they're going to have a meeting at the church across the street Thursday, and I want you to go. Well, this was probably a Monday, Tuesday. So he came Thursday morning. He said, you know they're having that meeting. He said, you know, I want you to go. I said, man, I don't want to be bothered with that. 4:30 maybe that evening, 4 o'clock he came to the house and I was in the bed. He said, hey man, I told you they're having that meeting. I said, I don't feel. He said, you get your ass up out of that damn bed. I'm tired of this. You've been in this bed for 2 years. Get on up and get your shower. We're going to this meeting. So I got mad, but I got up, took a shower, went over to the meeting, and they were talking about establishing this museum. They were asking me these questions, and I got to answer them. And that's how I got involved with the museum. Most of this stuff just fell into my lap. I have never looked for it. I was at fishing somewhere down in Muhlenberg County. And we was on our way home, and one of my partners, we stopped at the mall. He wanted to buy him some shoes or something. And I always go in the bookstore. I'm at a mall, so I go in this bookstore. I don't realize he came in the bookstore. But he see his book, and he's looking at it, and he's reading it, and it's mentioned in Russellville and Logan County. So he said, hey man, I'm buying this book for your birthday. I said, oh, that's cool. So I get the book. On the way home, I'm reading it. It's got the whole bio on Robert Young Thomas, who was the prosecutor in the Rufus Browder case. Like I said, it just fell into my hands. I always said it was God sent for some reason. But I always promised Miss Maddie. She said, if I give you this Bible, you got to promise me you'll tell this story. And I said, yes, ma'am, I would. Now, again, I got to be honest. When I said, yes, ma'am, I would, I was not intending on telling no damn story. It was just a promise that I gave her because she gave me the Bible. I never really had no idea how to tell a story, I guess, but, you know. So that's the reason I always said it was God, it wasn't me. When they get to the jail, they call a doctor, Dr. Madison Adderson. And Dr. Adderson comes and he checks Rufus's wound. He cleans it off and everything, and then he put a plaster Paris, which is the dressing you would put on a gunshot wound, on it. He later testified that he wasn't shot. Well, if he wasn't shot, why dress it for a wound? He's put in jail. This is about 6:30. Sheriff Ray and Jailer Butts had already got together because they figured that a mob would come get him. So Jailer Butts sent his son, James, to Sheriff Ray to get some leg and handcuffs. And he got the leg and handcuffs, and they marched him behind the jail to the railroad track and up the railroad track to the colored cemetery. The way it was supposed to go is that Sheriff Ray and his deputies would meet Jailer Butts' son out there and take over Rufus, but the mob came and seized the town. In Tom Ray's testimony, Tom Ray tells the court that the night of the murder of Cunningham, John Jones came to town on a train and told him he came to town on a train with 4 men who were coming to lynch Rufus. And Sheriff Ray asked him who they were, and he said he was scared to tell. Now, note, John Jones was on the square the night that the mob was here, but they didn't kill him that night. They waited until he was arrested and killed him a week or two later.
there were whites and blacks that talked about the lawlessness of the South needed to be controlled, needed to be stopped, and so forth. And so they were calling upon states to take measures. Okay. And in some states, they then did enact certain things. First of all, they came up with definitions of what constituted a lynching. A lynching, different than a murder, is that where someone is in the custody of the legal authorities, i.e., like let's say a person has been accused of rape or murder, you've arrested him and you've taken him back to the jail and you're stopped, and then he's taken away from you there, or he's broken out of jail. That would constitute a lynching. Most often a lynching was identified as involving more than one person, probably more than two people, in the group that took the person and executed the person. So they came up with definitions of lynchings.
Lynching is both complicated and very simple. The simple part is that lynching is designed to demonstrate publicly control. It's designed to create control and to intimidate others in that group. So in the case of 1908's lynching, the fact that 4 people who are not accused of a crime are lynched was designed to telegraph to Russellville's black community that you need to know your place, that your mutual aid society, the true reformers, the true reformers are actually mentioned several times during the case, that you should not belong to a group that supports one another. The idea is to control black citizens of Russellville. It's to make sure they do not feel free to organize for their mutual benefit or aid. And it's to make sure they understand that even doing something as simple as taking your sick wife to the doctor during the workday is not only not okay, but the bigger crime is to refuse a direct order from your white employer. And it's something for which you or your supporters could pay for that with your life.
Well, they came in and they took over the town. They stopped the train going north and searched it. They went and took the jailer and the sheriff and made them go to the square because each one kept telling them that the other one had Rufus. So they made them go to the square to try to determine where Rufus was. You know, back then you didn't have probably one town marshal and a sheriff and maybe one deputy. So 3 people against 50, 100 people, armed and masked, you know. It wasn't nothing, they just took the town.
To be fair, there are instances in Kentucky and elsewhere of when the person was in the custody of the legal authorities, that there were some instances of sheriffs and others saying that they were not going to allow that person to be turned over to the mob. So here in Kentucky, there are instances of where they stood up to the mob and fought them off. There are instances of where white jailers were actually shot and killed and the mob overpowered them. So there are whites who also were opposed to some of the lynchings that took place.
Well, they went to the jail and they asked him was Rufus there, and he told them no, that he turned them over to Sheriff Ray. They went and got Sheriff Ray and they said, "Where's Rufus? We want him, we come to get him." He said, "I left him with the jailer." So eventually, they ended up taking the jailer and the sheriff to the square to make them confront each other. And they still didn't get nothing out of them. They threatened to hurt them and everything, but they didn't get nothing out of them. And I've always said that I believe that Sheriff Ray had promised Fletcher that he would save his life, and he was trying to keep that promise. Spent the whole night at the cemetery, The mob ran around town. They went to the black sections of town and everywhere looking for Rufus. They never found him. The next morning, about 7:30, 8 o'clock, Deputy O'Connell put Rufus on the train and they shipped him to Bowling Green.
Rufus Browder's story and the case in Russellville in 1908 is extraordinarily complicated, and there aren't too many like it. What's more normative is that a lynch mob forms and they go rushing out to a jail and they pull somebody out of the jail and they lynch them. And it becomes a big public spectacle, but it happens fast. Or you go to someone's house and you pull them out of their home and you lynch them. But it's more immediate. But what this shows you is that vigilantism can also be served cold. It doesn't have to be served red hot. It can be seen, in this case, he's murdered his white employer. He claims self-defense. But everything about white control in Russellville and white supremacy is on the line if Rufus Browder goes free. So from the perspective of the vigilantes who follow him and he has to be moved from place to place, that shows how deeply serious this is in their view. No matter what a jury says or does, he cannot be allowed to live because his continued existence is an act of resistance, and they cannot allow that.
The people here would not represent. They made it clear we ain't representing him. He needs to be, killed. He's wrong. He didn't have no business killing kind of that. But the first teacher at Armstead was a guy named William L. Turner. He was a pastor and he was a teacher. But Turner was also big in the state Republican Party. So Turner, as being big in the state Republican Party, knew James C. Sims, who was probably one of Kentucky's most noted defense attorneys for that time, but who was also a Republican. So Turner recommended that Fletcher go see James C. Sims. And Fletcher went to see Sims and eventually Hardin.
It would be very difficult for a black person to get a lawyer if they were accused of shooting a white person at that time. There is no right to counsel in 1908 anywhere in the United States. So people sometimes had to defend themselves even on a capital murder charge without counsel. And that doesn't change until the 1930s as far as capital crimes. It doesn't become law for 50 states until 1963 in the case of Gideon versus Wainwright. So it's very possible that someone who had done something that created a great public outcry would not be able to find legal counsel in their area. In fact, it's very surprising that this person who's accused of murder was able to get counsel even from a neighboring city like Bowling Green.
In all black communities, you had lodges. After the Civil War, it was hard to bury black people. A lot of doctors in this area wouldn't give medical attention to black people. They wouldn't insure black people. So what happened was blacks got together and created these lodges, these groups, where they would put their own money up. And when somebody died, the money that everybody paid would help bury them. They were the social service for the day. And the True Reformer Lodge was a national lodge. It had branches in just about every state in the United States, and that was the lodge they were a member of.
the societies that were created, particularly in the 1880s and 1890s, first decade of the 20th century, were created as Jim Crow began to become the rule of law in the South. But it's also something that happens as many Black Americans move into the middle classes and they have some resources. So they create societies like the True Reformers. And the idea is that the community needs to take care of itself, and that those in the community who have the means to do it, this new Black middle class, can do it. So the True Reformers are a great example of this. We take care of ourselves and we take care of our own. But that's also very frightening in a world in which many white lawmakers and white Southerners are trying to create a separate and unequal world. They're passing Jim Crow laws at the state legislative level. They are moving to erase the gains that Black Americans had made after the Civil War and during Reconstruction, and creating a racial caste system. So mutual aid becomes even more important after that, because Black Southerners who have the means to help others do so.
You heard the phrase, probably home rule of the South. Democrats and whites can have home rule of the South as far as in racial concerns, and we'll leave states to make up their own laws and how to do education or voting districts or qualifications for voters. With the advent of things like vagrancy laws, poll taxes, grandfather clauses, segregations and accommodations in schools, separate but equal, the goal of Black subjugation and white supremacy by 1908 in each state had been started to set the foundation for the 20th century, to continue, at least in their view, in perpetuity. The larger idea of Black organizing in these social movement organizations, whether it's a church or a fraternal lodge, they become targets. Any of those organizing bodies, in a way, upsetting the racial order, could get the reaction of white violence.
The lodge actually passed they passed two resolutions. One, they said that Rufus had killed Cunningham in self-defense, and two, they want to raise money to help pay for the lawyer. And from what I was understanding is that they would arrested John and Virgil Jones at a lodge meeting. They were arrested for threatening Lawson, number one, and I want to say hindering the peace or something. I never did understand what that was. My guess is that somebody in the Black community tipped the quote-unquote leaders in the offices about this meeting, and the leaders in the office called the sheriff, and then eventually they came in and, for lack of a better word, raided the meeting. And Joe Riley, he was down here getting drunk at a, what they call them, a blind tiger. They used to call the bootlegger joints back in. And he had come out of one of the joints and shot a pistol in there. And Sheriff Ray them came and arrested him, and from my understanding is that when they arrested him, he had put the pistol up, so they could not arrest him for shooting the pistol. They arrested him for carrying a concealed deadly weapon. And that's how all of them ended up in jail. Boyer was his brother-in-law. Riley had nothing to do with it. And John and Virgil Jones are both lodge members of his. Judge Sandage and John Rhodes and James C. Sims had all known each other because I want to say Sims and Rhodes both was down here on the Guy Lyons case, which was a rape case a few years before that. So they knew each other. And Sims had sent John Rhodes down here to try to get information and work on the case. And John had went to the courthouse, and Judge Sandage had left word for him to meet him at the bank. And when he got to the bank, he told Rhodes, he said, you know, John, he said, you and James have a thriving and booming practice here in Logan County. He said, and this Browder thing can cause a lot of problems. He said, why don't y'all let me appoint him an attorney that will make sure that the forms of laws are followed? Everybody knows he's guilty, and because of that, he'll be given a fair trial and things will be done that should happen or something like that. And John Rhodes told him, said, well, Judge, I can't make that decision because I'm a junior partner in the firm. He said, would you allow me to use your phone and call my partner? And he called James C. Sims in Bowling Green. And Judge Sims said to John Rhodes, he said, John, does our shingles still hang out? And it took me 2 years to figure out what the hell he was talking about. But in those days, if you were a lawyer, you had a piece of wood or something that hung out in front of your building, denoting that you were an attorney and that you would represent people. And John Rhodes answered him and said, yes, it does. He said, well, this boy's father has paid us, and we're going to give him the best representation possible. And they did. They really did. Rhodes got back on the train and went back to Bowling Green, and the next morning, it was in all the newspapers about the lynching. I decided to do it in 208, the 100th year anniversary of the lynching. It was so funny. Man, when I said that thing at that board meeting, you could have heard a rat piss on cotton. They wanted no parts of that. But they didn't want to tell me no. So what they done, they said, you can do it, but we don't have the money to pay for it. And I went to one of the guys who got lynched, grandson. I said, if you put up some money, I'll put up some money. We eventually got together. And eventually, Historic Russellville got it together, and they put up a better exhibit. But they didn't want to do it at first. And I got a lot of flack from people in the neighborhood. Matter of fact, the guy who I started working for right here, he gave me hell about it. And that shocked me, because he was usually what you call progressive, I guess, or radical, but it shocked me. One of my coaches I went to school with, he gave me, you need to be doing positive stuff and telling about the teachers and the good things our people done. And I asked him, I said, well, Coach, I said, what if I tell the truth? Can I do that? And ain't the truth good? Yeah. A lot of people just didn't want to talk about it. for some reason, America is very uncomfortable with that. And they back up from it. They don't want to discuss it. But as a topic and as a nation, we are not healed until we start talking about it. We've got to start talking about it. It's very important to us healing, and it's very important to us coming together. Because the mob didn't come and get John and Virgil Jones immediately, in my mind, the people let their guard down. They waited a week or so. And at night, people started coming into town. And eventually a mob formed and went to the jail. They knocked on the jail door, and the jailer answered the door, and he was covered with rifles and pistols, and they asked him, "We come to get those Jones boys," or something like that. And when they went in, if you ever been in our jail, it's got this big metal jail. So they couldn't break the door down, so they had to get the keys from the jail, and he gave them the keys. And the first thing they asked him, he said, "Were they armed?" And my guess is, he thought maybe the jailer seen them coming and had armed the prisoners to protect themselves. And if they'd have been armed, they probably wouldn't have went in there. But he told them no, so they went in. And they were actually just looking for three people. They were looking for John Boyer, who had been informing Rufus what was going on, John and Virgil Jones, who were members of the True Reformers. So they go in and they grab him. The legend has always said is that they said is, "Hey, there's an extra one in here." They said, "Well, who is it?" They said, "I don't know." Said he's at the wrong damn place at the wrong damn time. And they brought him on out. They said they tied their hands behind their backs and marched them down the street past the mayor's house, and then went on out to Armstrong. There was a black man in the woods that I've never been able to identify. They only make reference to him in the newspapers. But he was back in the woods and he witnessed it all. And when they got him out there, they said they lynched one and made everybody else look. Then they lynched the next one and made the other two look. Then they lynched the third one and made the last man look. And the last man was to be Virgil Jones. And they said Virgil broke away and started fighting. Eventually, a guy was supposed to hit him in the head with a rifle and knocked him down. And they were supposed to throw the rope around his neck, drug him back up to where they lynched the other guys, and put him on the street. The amazing thing was they put a typed, written note around his neck. They said, "Let this be a warning to you niggas to let white folk alone, or you'll go the same damn way. Your lodges and your halls better shut up and quit."
You can see the thread from the slavery days is that the scholars who looked at slavery and violence and then looked at violence later on, said violence is a white method of control, that it's very much done to make sure that all black people understand their place. Now, I said all black people. It is true that in America, in Kentucky, elsewhere, there were people other than blacks who were lynched. There were people who were Native Americans lynched in some places, depending on if they had a population there. There were Mexican Americans, there were immigrants coming to America, and of course there were white Americans who were lynched. But the greatest proportion of people lynched, far exceeding their numbers in the population anywhere, were blacks. And that's why you could still say it was a method of control for them. And the lynching of one black person, just like the killing of a slave back during the slavery period, would be a warning to all others that this is what could happen to you for somehow getting out of your place, defining whites, of course, attacking whites if someone said you had gotten into an altercation or murdered someone. So lynchings is a form of racial control, and that's why it occurred in Kentucky and elsewhere.
You know, my grandmother was 8 years old when all this happened. She lived right there. Townsend Grove, Cedar Grove Church is right here. She lived right beside the church. Cunningham and the Browders lived right around the corner. Man, she did not go for that. She didn't want to mess with them white people. Not only her, most people here. You didn't challenge anything, because to challenge, you would be considered a troublemaker. And that's the last thing you want to be considered a troublemaker. If you was a maid, you couldn't get to work. If you was a farmer, you couldn't get to work, It intimidated not only her generation, but 4 or 5 generations after that. It was passed on. It was a fear that was passed on. That morning, David B. Estes, who was a Confederate veteran, was said to have been taking his cows off the pasture and discovered the bodies. And he got in touch with the officials, and eventually people started coming from everywhere to view him on the tree. About probably 8 or 9 o'clock that morning, Judge Edwards ordered the bodies cut down. They were taken in front of the Logan County Courthouse and laid out, and a coroner's inquest was held over the bodies. The coroner said that they died by parties unknown.
It's tied to this idea that vigilantism is an act of terrible violence, but it's also construed as an act of popular will, bringing popular will to life. And there's a term, popular constitutionalism, that we see, where people believe very sincerely that they have a responsibility to act if they don't think the legal system is going to act. And frequently, what's interesting about lynching is that sometimes these mobs act before the legal system has an opportunity to do anything with the case. They want to make sure that what they construct as justice is done. And it is about terrorizing the black population or whatever group they want to other. And they want to show that they need to stay in their lane and they need to maintain control. There are examples of Jewish people, for example, in Atlanta who are lynched at the height of anti-Semitic activity in Atlanta. So it's the same thing. You other someone, and then a mob will come in and take them out and lynch them, and do it publicly, and do it in a way where they not only take responsibility, but they document it, and they send the cards to their friends, and they make it very clear that if you don't do exactly what we say and how we say to do it, then this will happen to you.
That note that is attached to them that says this is what happens to these folk when they mess with white people means nothing is going to change the status quo. So that's why I think those young men were lynched.
The other thing that we know about lynching is that it's also one of the most photographed crimes. I mean, normally you don't photograph a crime, do you? You don't want a record. People don't want to get caught. But the fact that an extrajudicial lynch mob will take pictures, they will have postcards made, they will send them to family members and friends as if this was a vacation. They want to document what they've done, and it lets people know that this is what will happen if you get out of line, and it will also let other white people know that this is what I've done in order to control people that need to be controlled.
I was at home asleep the other day, and my brother let this young girl back in, and she hit me on the head. I said, what the hell is this? And I woke up. She said, are you Mr. Morrow? I said, yeah. She said, I want to see that lynching exhibit. I said, you want to see the lynching exhibit? I'm 2:30 sleeping. I said, what the hell is this thing in my head? Couldn't have been no more than 18, 17 years old. She said, I seen something online, and it bothered me, and I just want to come see it. I just come down here to see it. Would you mind letting me look at it? I said, well, let me get my shoes and stuff on, get a coat, and I'll be over. When I got over, she was sitting on the step. So I opened the door, and she said, can I sit here and just read this stuff? I said, yeah, I'll sit here with it. Well, to me, that was just as important as somebody famous coming, because you had a young kid striving and looking for knowledge. When she got ready to leave, she said, Mr. Morrow, she said, I'm trying to get a better understanding of my people. She said, I hope this will help me. I said, it might. So I get outside and I lock the door. I said, let me ask you something. I said, how old are you? She said, I'm 18. I said, you like history? She said, yeah. I said, I tell you what, I said, I'm gonna give you a card. I said, why don't you come volunteer and help me a couple of weekdays a week? I said, we got so much stuff and you can learn so much more. She said, I love it. Well, to me, that was important. This was somebody you didn't have to make do anything. She came on her own. So if we can do that a little more, I think, to me, those are the important things, is that when you get these people thriving and wanting this knowledge, not only about the lynching, but about Dunnigan and about the schools and about the bills. The way you change a nation is you change not their minds, you change their hearts. And I think people's hearts are changing a little bit. The next thing to come was the trial for Rufus. Rufus would go through 3 trials. The first trial, I want to say, was maybe September 1908. And the first trial was a hung jury. But however it was, the one who hung the jury up, one of them was run out of town, they say. The next trial was probably October, November, a little later, and he was given a death penalty.
So in a real sense, it looks as if Kentucky is abiding by the law. But I would say, but the whole premise of having a trial for Rufus Browder is not consistent with what would have happened if Rufus Browder had been a white man, a white sharecropper involved in that. That it would have, by the time the grand jury looked at that, the grand jury would have come back and said, that's justifiable homicide. Or let's say if there had in fact been a trial, it's hard to conceive of a white man in the same situation as Rufus Browder being sentenced to death in that kind of situation. It's just doesn't, the Kentucky records don't bear out white people being put to death like he was sentenced to death.
His lawyers, Judge Sims and John Rose, filed a special appeal to the State Court of Appeals, asking them to meet in special session to save his life. They came back and met in special session, and they granted Rufus a change of venue and sent the case to Simpson County. But they also said one more thing, that they wanted him x-rayed.
The convoluted set of circumstances that lead to Rufus Browder not being x-rayed is a good example of how many white people in the justice system are not going to put themselves out there for a black defendant. And there are a lot of reasons they might make that decision. They fear retaliation, or they desire to maintain control, like the vigilantes desire to maintain control. And as a historian, I'd have to know more about the circumstance, and sometimes that's not knowable. I mean, some people are not public enough, or they don't leave us enough clues that we can really understand what their intent was. But historians' best guess here is that it's about maintaining racial control, or someone who is afraid of risking their own position by helping a black defendant who has shot a white man. So again, what is the motivation to put yourself out there on the line? Not everybody's going to do it.
The next trial, I want to say, was in 1909 in Simpson County. And at that trial, Rufus was given life in prison. His lawyers, John Rhodes and J.C. Sims, felt that the best thing to do was let the verdict stand and appeal to Governor Wilson to issue a pardon. And they felt the best way to do that was to do it when Wilson was getting ready to come out of office. And they felt they had to do it then because Wilson understood the circumstances better than any other governor would.
One could say it was unusual, and I think the fact that those 4 young men had been lynched led to so much attention being focused on it, led to him having a trial, and then another trial, and then yet another one. And so on that regard, it was in fact different there, but again, the outcome of it was consistent with what had always occurred in that regard. What would have been remarkable would have been for him to have been found not guilty and let go. A jury did not do that.
He reviewed everything, and he eventually didn't give him a pardon, but he commuted the sentence to 10 years with good time served. So Rufus was supposed to get out of jail. And what I was told is that he was supposed to get out. His father heard he was getting out, and they went to the train station to meet him. And when they got to the train station, they went to look for the Jim Crow car. They went to that person. They said, "What are you talking about, the Jim Crow car?" Well, at that time, Kentucky had segregated railroad cars. They had one car just for blacks. So when they found that Rufus wasn't on the Jim Crow car, they asked the conductor, they said, "Hey, we're looking for Rufus Browder. He just got out of prison at Lyon County, and he's supposed to be on this train." And the conductor said, "Well, I got him here, by God." And they took him back to a boxcar, and they opened the door, and it was a pine box, and Rufus was in the pine box. His death certificate said that he died of tuberculosis, but nobody in the family never heard of it. They assumed that he was coming home alive, but when he got home, he was dead. He was buried out to the Cedar Grove Church. It's the Rufus Browder story, I guess. That's it. I would probably like them to understand that the way America's race has come together is a dichotomy of stories. That there's just not one story. That you can't take no one fixed story about slavery, or no one fixed story about lynching, or no one fixed story about segregation, and make it all the stories. That you have to take these stories one at a time, and each one is unique to my people. And that's probably what I would do. I hope they thrive. I hope we get more people in. I hope they help educate the community, the state, and the nation. And I also hope I find some young people to take my place because I'm getting old, and it's important that it keeps on. And the only way anything can survive is that you bring young blood into it.
By the 1920s, okay, then you say 1930s, 1940s going forward, the number of lynchings declined, okay? I say in my book on racial violence that the state takes the place of the lynch mob. That in many instances, so many black people are put to death after a sham trial that they have, that Kentucky itself acknowledges it and says that there must be a 30-day period from when a person is found guilty and when he is executed. Why did they do that? Because in so many instances, they had a trial in the morning and executed the person at noon. The very same time period. They then said we have to wait 30 days, but you then go back and you say where the judge said we waived it because of the hostility of the mob. We went ahead and waived it and executed them anyway. And you then say, but no, that's the reason you couldn't execute. You needed for things to calm down. Even though the number of lynchings ultimately declines, I ask the question, when did legal lynchings end in the state of Kentucky? So there were pressures put on in the 1920s, but legal lynchings replaced these other lynchings that had occurred.
This is like going to the state fair. When you go to the state fair, you get your photos taken and everything. This is a state fair. You know, people miss this. And people don't like to talk about this, but this is the fact. You had people that would bring picnic baskets to watch people be murdered, burn at the stake. Then after it was over, they would go cut pieces off and take them home. Now how sadistic is this? If you got any humanity in you, this thing is gonna make you mad. But at the same time, you will learn what should not happen to anybody, regardless if they black or white or rich or poor or gay or Catholic or Jew. If we're gonna argue to the world that we're such a great nation, we've got to live up to that promise. And one part of living up to that promise is that everybody will be treated justly in the eyes of the law. That everybody will be given a fair day in court. That you won't be snatched out of the law's hands and put on a tree. That you won't be gunned down in the law's hands for what you allegedly done. Not what was proven, but what you allegedly done. And if you believe in a nation, you have to stand up for that for everybody. So I guess that's just how I see it, though. But you know, if you believe, you have to stand up for everybody. And by standing up for the people that you dislike and hate or disagree with, you actually stand up for everybody. And that's hard. That's really hard. You know, I don't agree with Klansmen, but I don't think you should lynch them. And I would stand up to fight against lynching them. I think if they've done something wrong, they ought to have a chance to go through the law and the courts, and the jury shouldn't be stacked, and we'd hope the judge wouldn't be biased. You'd hope they get a fair chance, because that's what our nation has sold for 200 years. That's what so many others have bought. And how does it crush you when you find out what they sold you and put in your grocery bag was supposed to be one thing, but when you got home and started to cook, it was another.
Death don't have no mercy in this land. Death don't have no mercy in this land. He'll come to your house and he won't stay long. You look in the bed and somebody be gone. Death don't have no mercy in this land. Well, death will go in any family in this land. Death will go in every family in this land. Well, they'll come to your house and they won't stay long. Well, you look in the bed and one in the family will be gone. Death will go in any family in this land. Well, he never takes a vacation in this land. Well, death never take a vacation in this land. Well, he'll come to your house and he won't stay long. You look in the bed and your mother will be gone. Death never takes a vacation in this land. Talk. Great God. leave you standing and crying in this land. Well, death will leave you standing and crying in this land. Well, he'll come to your house and it won't stay long. You look in the bed and leave somebody will be gone. Death will leave you standing crying in this land. Oh, death's always in a hurry in this land. Oh, death's always in a hurry in this land. Well, he'll come to your house and he won't stay long. You look in the bed and your mother will be gone. Death's always in a hurry in this land. Well, they won't give you time to get ready in this land. Well, they won't give you time to get ready in this land. Oh, well, they come to your house and it won't stay long. Well, you look in the bed and somebody'll be gone. Death won't give you time to get ready in this land. Make your last talk. Talk to me then. Talk to me then.
Before we get started, I just want to introduce our panelists to everyone. To my immediate left is Dr. David Childs, and he is Director of Black Studies and Associate Professor of Social Studies, Education, and History here at NKU. He has an amazing resume, and I asked his permission to maybe shorten it a little bit because it's so much for me to read. But he wears a lot of hats, and all of them have to do with social studies, Black history. I think there's some theology in there, some arts in there. As I said, he does a lot. To his left is Dr. Eric Jackson, who is also here at NKU. He's Professor of History and Associate Dean in the College of Arts and Sciences. 33 years of academic experience at the university level. He also sits on the Board of Trustees at our library, among other organizations that he's involved with, just like Dr. Childs is. And then, of course, Joetta. Dr. Joetta Pro is a retired psychologist, and I can attest that she does have a passion for social justice and history. She's done quite a bit of research at our history center and with me. We've learned some good things together. She is not a native to the area. She grew up in Missouri. And she is very active in St. John's Unitarian Universalist Church, which brought her back to Boone County to study our history with the Universalist Church there, and maybe she'll tell us a little bit about that. But where I wanted to start was why are we talking about this horrible event that occurred in Russellville in 1908? What does that have to do with us? I know I gave you some hints earlier about that there were some similar events that occurred in Boone County. And I want to ask Joetta if she would mind giving an overview how this started and why we brought this film here, because she is the reason that we had the screening. She asked if we could do that. So Joetta?
Thanks, Hillary. First of all, I just want to thank everyone for participating, for coming out tonight, either in person or online. Really appreciate that. I did ask the library, I did ask Hillary if we could show this documentary because I thought it might help us to generate interest in the history here. I first became aware of that history after I attended our Unitarian Universalist Church conference and heard Brian Stevenson speak. He's the director of the Equal Justice Initiative and has done amazing work in many areas of justice, but in particular about the history of lynching in our country. I have some materials from EJI with me here if anyone's curious to see them. I heard him speak, and that was when I first heard that there was, I was like, oh my, I really need to understand this better. I knew there had been lynchings, but 4,000, you know. So I came home and I Googled Boone County, Kentucky lynching to see what happened, what I would find. And what it led me to was the work that Hillary and others at the Boone County Library had already done to gather that history. That work has expanded since then. Back then it was just kind of very brief snippets. And Hillary has delved into the details of those 7 lynchings and created a storyboard and summaries for each of the stories of those victims and the context and settings were and stuff. And so there's been a lot of work done since then.
There has. And Joetta also has organized some of us to start the process, which this is part of discussions and introducing this topic to our community for the purpose of acknowledging first that these things occurred, because, you know, not to be trite, but if we don't acknowledge the history, are we doomed to repeat it? I should hope not. But there is a process that Brian Stevenson's organization at EJI, they actually have, if you've not heard of it, there is a memorial in Montgomery, Alabama, that is
Amazing.
honoring the lynching victims throughout the country. And the memorial has these sort of like hanging pillars. It's a visual that does summon the image of someone being hanged. But they have inscribed names and assigned each piece of that to a locality. There is one for Boone County there. Their recording starts a year after 2 lynchings that occurred in Boone County. I've been trying to get them to add those names, but they only can do what they can do. And what they do offer is, if we can make it through this process as a community, we can honor those victims here with a companion memorial that can be brought to our county. But there is a long process to that. And that's not something you want to spring on everybody without some context, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not exactly an easy topic.
Right.
And some people would never want to think about it or engage about it. And I understand that, but yet it is a really important history.
In summary, that's sort of how we got here, and this is part of that. So what I would like to ask Dr. Childs or Dr. Jackson, their take on one of the things that stood out to me in the film was some similarities and some differences to what happened here, but there is a common thread. There is this balance of power that's been upset. And I noticed the comments and the portion of the film where they talk about, where Michael Morrow talks about how Rufus Browder ran and how that's perceived then and now differently. Any thoughts on that? Either one of you. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm going to throw it to you.
I think the larger context has to be dealt with first before we even talk about the particulars. I think the larger context to deal with is the concept of lynching and trauma, of how you negotiate that. Even before he runs, he's got trauma going on. How do you negotiate that trauma in a country in which you're not looked upon as a human being, you're looked upon as property? And so even before he starts running, that could parallel others to do the same thing. Understanding the impact of trauma on the victims and the perpetrators is important to understand from the beginning process. because it affects everybody in different ways. Those who are perpetrating these activities of lynching and those folks who are dealing with it. And as a country, I think we're still dealing with some of that trauma.
Yeah.
Piggybacking on what Dr. Jackson said, I want to go back to that original question of why are we here? And we're in a country, especially this particular social historical moment, whereby we like to pretend these things did not happen. And these people have, I particularly was in tune at the end when they were showing the bios. These individuals had families, they had children, they were brothers. When you do that, you humanize them, because we can look at the number 4,000 plus individuals that were lynched in this country, and they had the time frame on there when they were lynched, going back to I think the 1870s, and it's a statistic.
Right.
But when you begin to say this was a father, he had a way to make money. He had, just like you and I, he did farming, for example, to make a living, to take care of his family, to get something to eat, to have a livelihood. This person was, and anybody would have a labor dispute. Anybody gets indignant if somebody's trying to cheat them. He's a human, but as long as Americans, we ignore history and we say things like it happened so long ago, you're being negative. The interesting thing was also that they accused, when the museum owner began to do this kind of work, they said, why don't you focus on something positive?
Right.
Well, we hear that a lot in our country.
Sure.
In fact, it's one of the political talking points that a lot of people that bring up issues of social justice and civil rights, whether it's race, class, or gender, they're being negative.
Right.
And and so the push is to tell a Pollyannish, idealized version of history. The great heroes, they're usually white males that were perfect. We deify them.
Right.
And so when you try to dig, when I was trained as a historian, one of the things we were pushed to do is look at the documents and try our best to let the documents tell the story, and not sort of impose our own values into the document. And so just being honest about what this history says. So it's thrilling to see this history being brought out. My uncle was almost lynched. He was abducted by the Klan in the South, and he was traumatized and sexually assaulted. The circumstances how he got there, he was stranded in the woods, and he went looking for help, and he ran into some of these same type of people, vigilante crowd, and they brutalized him and assaulted him. And so these things
It was not
touch
that
us
long ago.
today, right?
Right.
Yeah, and we were in a church service, and he had never told anybody, and he's not an old man either. And it just spilled out.
Right.
He got up to speak, and our mouth was wide open. My grandmother was a sharecropper. She picked cotton. So
Right.
a lot of these things, when people say this happened so long ago,
Right.
why are we still talking about it? You're being negative. It's part of this strategy of it's a white supremacist tool.
Yeah.
To really control the narrative.
And that trauma, that
Historical trauma,
yeah,
yes.
the trauma is present in the white community and the Black community and the immigrant community. Everyone has some form of that, and I thought it was interesting that Michael Morrow was talking about the man who kind of prompted him to lift himself up when he couldn't read, was the one that was saying, "Shh, now be quiet about that." I want to give you all a chance. Does anybody have a comment or question that you would like to direct to any of the panelists or myself? It's a shy bunch. I know you're probably still absorbing it. Let me tell you, you have one? Do you have one? Oh my goodness. All right. Wonderful.
Speak into this?
Yeah.
Wow. I just was so struck by just what Dr. Childs said. You know, the head of UK announced that they're doing away with their diversity.
Yes.
Yeah, their DCI up department. And, I have a number of friends and, of course we're writing our congressman, but I know the reason he did that is because the legislature next year will just pass it. But it struck me that so you talk about memory, and I don't know what's going on in the world today.
Right.
I am flabbergasted. How long? I mean, it's only been a couple of years since Mr. Floyd died.
Yeah.
And it's like it's forgotten.
Yeah.
All that's forgotten.
Can I ask you a question? Are you from this area?
Yes.
Okay.
Up to
How much
Indiana
did
Island.
you know or learn growing up about the history of enslavement or any Reconstruction and
Oh,
beyond violence or civil rights violations happening here?
I I think I have studied more than I
Right.
learned when I was growing up.
Right.
That is for sure.
So that's part of it. I often say, if I hadn't started working at this job, I wouldn't know where it was that I grew up. There are a lot of wonderful things too that I would love to also share with the community about Northern Kentucky and the county and the region and all of it. But I was flabbergasted when I learned that there were lynchings here. And if you were interested enough to go to the EJI site and look at the statistics, we're in the upper probably quarter in terms of just the number of lynchings that occurred in Boone County. Now, Kenton and Campbell, not as many, but I had a woman that I know very well say, no, there was this one that I know about, and it was a legal hanging, but as we were sort of given hints about due process, going to court doesn't always mean that you're getting a fair trial, correct? And due process, the community didn't feel like that was met. Parts of the community didn't feel like that was met. She perceived that as a lynching, and certainly it's a language thing. But there is something to be said for having a public airing of
Right.
whatever the charges are. And let's see the proof and let's talk about that. Because I do think among us, there are people who understand fairness and say, whoa, 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 whoa. Whether or not we can stop it is another thing altogether.
I don't want to on this, but I do genealogy, and a lot of people just go through the censuses and they say, but you need to look into that,
Sure.
find out what your family
Right.
has done,
Yeah.
who they have owned. I mean,
And that's part of the pushback though.
well,
And it's okay to learn that. It's okay to learn that. There is an organization, if you're interested, called Coming to the Table. That brings together descendants of enslaved people and descendants of enslavers for positive conversation and healing. And that's partially what we want to do in terms of acknowledgement in Boone County. If I can go back a little bit to you all, and I thank you for your comments and your questions. You're right. I agree with everything said in terms of looking at your own family history, and everybody needs to do that in the best way that they know how, if they are ready to do, if and when they are ready to do that. I think it's healing. But I wondered too how you all felt about the patriotism side of that discussion, where Michael Morrow talks about the promise of America and that being an argument to better ourselves as communities, as a country, to live up to those standards that we advertise to the world. That's what we're about.
So one of the I read a quote that said one of the most contested areas in the country where the power struggle is happening in the school boards.
Mhm.
There are groups trying to seize the school boards and think tanks, trying to send well-funded people
Sure.
to win school board elections because they're trying to control the narrative, they're trying to control the ideas.
Yeah.
They're trying to define civics, like civic seals programs. I was a part of the group in Kentucky that was trying to define what civic seals were, and we got pushed back because people wanted to own that notion of patriotism. And same with what happened with Colin Kaepernick. They,
Right.
you know, if some people they probably would have lynched him if they could have, but they were so people get outraged about this notion of patriotism and who gets to define what it means. It's a nationalism. It's a
Right.
their definitions
There's
of
a
hyper
difference.
nationalism, a sort of national socialism almost. This hyper patriotism and this bullying that's going on.
Right.
If we remember during the election, the last election, there were armed people or people going to the polls,
Sure.
intimidating folks,
Watchers.
and they were taking away mailboxes, trying to shut down the U.S. postal system. It's that same spirit behind that. And the lynch mob mindset.
Right.
That,
There is a mob mentality to all of
Yeah.
that, and and it doesn't pack the punch, but bullying is a good way to put it because there's bullying across the board in those statements that you had. Did you have somebody that had a question? Oh, you do. Oh, Carolyn.
Hi. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it. My name is Carolyn Wolf. I'm actually on the Board of Education in Boone County. I come from Hampton, Virginia. So I grew up, that's where I graduated in high school. And so I grew up in a very diverse community where Black history was a foundation of our education in public schools. Here in Boone, we're looking at a minority population of a little less than 5%. And we have about 20,000 kids. We've got about 60 to 80, depending on who you ask, languages and dialects within the county itself. And one of the things I notice when we have conversations about incorporating Black history or any history other than the standard stuff is it's not relevant because our population doesn't look like that, or it doesn't meet most of what our population looks like. How do you recommend we have conversations with our community and our parents and our leaders to say, this is relevant, even if it doesn't look like you. This is important. How do we do that, and how do we incorporate that into an education system that needs to grow in the direction that its population is growing?
For me, I'm not really sure the best way of doing it. I would say to empower your parents and people in the community with resources so they can do it on their own. Because the system is what it is. I mean, you may not get a consensus, but if you empower people in the community, empower themselves, they can do it for themselves.
Can I tell you about an event that I know about that happens at Lloyd High School? I don't know if you've seen this because I know you're in Boone County and Lloyd is in Erlanger, Ellesmere, but our history center had a tabling event, and the kids at Lloyd get to set up tables, and they also have community members and groups come in and set up tables, and it's like a culture day. And those kids brought it. So there were kids from all different backgrounds and cultural backgrounds, and they were bringing clothing for people to try on. They were bringing music that they played while they danced. They were bringing food and drink for people to try. And it was an amazing experience to be part of that. And that was just like one school. Then they would bring the middle schoolers through because it's right next door. But incrementally, like Dr. Jackson said, giving parents and caregivers tools is important. But I also think that having an experience that includes everybody in that environment is just as important as giving them a history book and saying this is what the real story is.
I would add, this is our history. There's this notion in this country that when you talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the context of this conversation, there's this notion that when you talk about African American history, that the white folks can tune out, and this is only for Black people. That's a narrative that needs to change. You can have a community that's completely homogenous, completely European American, but this is the country for everybody. Just because a person does not look like you, doesn't mean you need to tune out. This is the idea that diversity programs are for people of color. That needs to change.
Yeah.
In fact, the way to learn about prejudice and racism is to look at a community and see what it looks like. People are teaching about race by being homogenous. You're saying this, we don't want these individuals included. I tell my students that often that this is all of our history and we need to learn it as well. That's really key to it's the American story is broader than Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, white males. But for example, I mean, you can take any historical moment, broader historical moment, Civil War. Native Americans fought on both sides. The black contribution, of course. All throughout history, you can say the same thing. And so we need a broader narrative. I think a big part of it is the way history has been taught in this country. So in some ways lays on the lap of history teachers. They've taught a very homogeneous, narrow narrative for as long as this country has been here. And so we're trying to undo it. We're playing catch up.
Did you have something you wanted to add, Joanna?
Well, I'm just sitting here thinking, how do we get the broader community going kind of circling back to the concept of the project, the effort to bring awareness about this history. How do we get people to be willing to listen and learn and kind of sit with the pain of that? I'm speaking especially white people, but it's a different kind of pain, I know, also for Black people to sit with this. So it's different, but nevertheless, how do we build up our ability to tolerate that and
let me ask you all.
join with it?
So we do programming through our History Center at the library. One of our most popular programs is an Underground Railroad tour. That's everybody's history, but that's Black history. And nobody argues with us about having that program. People really enjoy that program. And we did a dedication for a grave marking for a Revolutionary War soldier. There are many of those in Boone County. This one happened to be African American. It's incremental and it's local. And if there is a way to keep reminding people that white males were not the only people in the history and everybody contributed, and bringing the humanity into individuals and telling a story about one person, I think is a good way to start locally. And I think we had somebody, did you have a question, ma'am, up in the blue jacket? Yes. Oh, I'm sorry, we'll get to you next. Okay.
Yep. So I'm representing the virtual audience tonight.
Great.
And we have a couple of questions. The first goes back to some locations. Do you have any information specifically on maybe what happened in Covington with lynchings? I'm going to add to that. Is there a place where people can find resources for maybe their specific area? Since we do have kind of a
Northern Kentucky regional sort of. So I have a lot of information on the Boone County lynchings because those are the ones that I've done the deep dive into researching. I don't have information on illegal lynchings in Covington. There are other Northern Kentucky localities that I do have documented lynchings occurring. Maysville is one that had some fairly horrific events that were well documented because they made it into the newspapers. So in answer to that, if this person is willing to do a little research on their own, historic newspapers are a good place to start. And caveat, they're not always right. So do your homework behind that. In terms of locations, that is sometimes a contested thing because roads change, communities grow. You know, what used to be a creek over here, now they can move those too. So in Covington, for instance, there was a public hanging of a man who was formerly enslaved. That's all well documented. Those kinds, and again, a legal hanging doesn't mean a fair trial. We're talking about in the 1870s for that particular instance. So yes, the libraries and local history organizations are a good place to start, and as are the newspapers.
And then one more from online, going back to the film, what is the racial climate in Russellville now? And are there any descendants of the men who did the lynchings? Do we have any history from them?
The only thing I can say about that is the Sikh Museum that they kept showing that Michael Morrow is part of also includes the home of a former enslaver who became a gradual emancipationist. He was a Revolutionary War soldier, so it's this magnificent home. This area is different than our area in a lot of ways. There are descendants of people who were lynched there, but they're also honoring. There's a woman, and her name escapes me, but she was the first Black female um, White House correspondent. There's a statue of her in town. There's also a Confederate memorial in town. It's a complicated place, very different socially than here. But what I can say is because there are descendants of enslaved people still living in their community, they have a deep connection. That's how that museum came to be. There were out migrations from Boone County in northern Kentucky, partially because the geography, but there was racial terror happening. People were being pushed out. Sundown towns. If you know what that is, you know what I'm talking about. So it's apples and oranges, but they have been able to, because they still have people who were involved in these histories, make an impact in their community now. I think it was the woman in the blue jacket. And you guys.
The provost. It's the provost.
So this is the second time that I've seen this. And each time, the thing that strikes me most, and I want to ask the two historians if there's any writings about this. If you notice the picture, we're in the Bible Belt. I was born and raised in this area. And when you look at the images, people are smiling. They're smiling. They're not sad. They're not just observing. They're smiling. Youngsters, older people. Are there any writings that would help us understand how likely Christians in those crowds were smiling when and using the argument that they didn't consider them human is hard because I grew up also in a family of hunters, and we don't have pictures of us smiling that big holding the deer. Does that make sense? So have you read anything that helps us understand that?
So first of all, that's the provost, vice president of academic affairs.
Thank you for coming.
Put some respect on that name. I just wanted to make a larger comment. Dr. Jackson and I, we had the quick meeting on how we would respond. I'm going to make some larger comments. Then I think he's going to get into the weeds. So you have to really go back to and just understand the broader perspective of how African Americans have been viewed in this country as property, as not being valued. There's a joke in the Black community that if you're watching a horror movie, the first person to be killed, and you can watch it, is a Black person. And the heroine is often a blonde woman. The woman that the monster passes over is a blonde white woman. And so it's interesting about who we value. And so I think historically, if you go back to enslavement, especially in the South, folks are used to not seeing Black people as human. And so when you get to the period, this time period that we're talking about, there's this notion that they deserved it. Even today, when people defend police officers for killing unarmed Black people with no due process, there's this vehement anger that why would you even say anything about the police officers? Of course the Black person did it. And that's that same mindset that would allow people to come out with sort of picnic baskets and laugh and point because of course they deserved it. They're not human and they're despicable. Franz Fanon wrote a book, The Wretched of the Earth. And that's how African Americans have been portrayed. So I just wanted to make some broader comments. And so a lot of the readings that I've done deal with this notion of dehumanization of Black people. So,
Like the border.
Yes, exactly.
Like undocumented people at the border. And we've heard a lot of that language in our modern times. And I think that it does lend itself to that. When I hear people say illegals, illegal what? You know, and it's the same thing with someone saying, we have been working towards changing the language around enslavement because a slave indicates an identity. And it's not an identity. It's a something that's put onto someone. And so that's why, you see academics talking about the changing language, but language makes an impact in dehumanizing. So yes.
But just to get back to the provost question about Christianity, particularly in this area, specifically, just broad stroking it, is that Christianity in itself is not necessarily or was a tool and still is to empower folks to treat them well. I think Christianity has been used to liberate people and oppress people at the same time. So, because there's a difference between having faith, Christianity, and an organized religion. They're not all the same. And so I think the manifestation of it, of using Christianity to justify enslavement and justify treating people badly, you can find that in Christianity, but you can also find Christianity lifting people up. So I think there's some contradictions that goes on in Christianity and their faith, and what goes on consistently is not consistent.
Right.
And so it's complex. So because African Americans created a Christianity that's called Black theology or liberation theology, that tried to liberate themselves, while other folks took Christianity to justify enslavement. And so the pictures that you see people, I think it's not just a Christian piece. I think it's, again, that's what I mentioned earlier, is trauma. That people are traumatized in a way to make violence normal. It's a normal thing. And so it became part of that trauma of negotiating. It's part of my normal upbringing, not just the folks who were lynched, but also the perpetrators, because it becomes part of their normal life. And so you don't even question it anymore. And so it's something you just kind of engage in, and you don't even think about it because you've been traumatized. Not to even think about it. It's just what we do. It doesn't make sense to folks who are against violence, but in that world, it's just part of their trauma.
Right.
And for me, it's trying to figure out, as a couple books I've been writing, is how to give people guardrails to deal with their trauma. You can't just open these boxes up of this trauma and say, okay, deal with it.
Right.
No, what skill set can you empower people to deal with trauma? Is it counseling? Is it knowing the history? You just don't open these Pandora's box and say, go at it, because then you create more problems. You have to create guardrails and skills. How do you do that?
In the film, I noticed that the way that I know the pace was methodical. I know it's a little slow, probably for the younger audience especially, but they were creating so much modern context in that film. Did you catch it? I was just, and you said you watched it a couple of times. You catch it even more each time. And it was important to take notice of the fact that there was that trauma when the man said, why don't you talk about the nice things? He doesn't want to deal with that trauma. And then you have Michael Morrow, who never heard of any of this, but knew that his own grandmother knew what the line was and not to cross it. And these people are living in this town. He went one little mention of the grandson of one of the men who was lynched helped to pay for his exhibit. So there is that trauma. It's absolutely there.
I just want to quickly go back to what he said in terms of this notion of religion. And I've said in my writings, often white supremacy masquerades as Christianity. And so people's interpretation of religion and Christianity is rooted in white supremacy. If you look at a lot of the old literature in the mid to even late 20th century, when you see depictions of the saints, depiction of the church, it's white folks. And it goes further, and often people of color are demonized as being more sinful. Like, look at the drug trade, how the crack epidemic was treated versus the heroin epidemic, which came into the white community. Often, when people think of sin in the bad neighborhoods, they think of black neighborhoods. And so I think it is disturbing that a lot of people in these communities are so-called Christians. And the African-American interpretation is often rooted right in liberation, like you just said. Most African-American preachers, especially in the South, it wasn't long until they were going to talk about freedom. How can you be, especially during enslavement and then the civil rights movement, how can you be a preacher worth your salt as a black preacher and not deal with people losing land, people being lynched, people being, they were afraid to do it, but the most courageous people did it, and often they lost their lives. And so I think that's a huge point to bring out.
And I think the other part of this is, even from a Christian standpoint, one of the basic tenements of Christianity, it's so basic, people kind of fumble over it, is treat others like you want to be treated.
Right.
That's
Golden
not
rule.
really that complicated.
Right.
It's not that complicated.
It must be harder to do.
Apparently for other people it is. Just treat
Okay.
people like you want to be treated. And that's the basis of a lot of Christian faith, that they kind of complicate stuff.
That's a good way to leave us with that. We have one more. Is that correct? We have one more? One more question?
I'd just like to follow up on this issue of trauma. Earlier this spring, we visited Birmingham and Montgomery, and I was really struck with the lynching memorial, where they have at the end the reconciliation idea. And one of the things I noticed was one of the counties in Kentucky that seemed to have the largest reconciliation project is Shelby County.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering how that came to be.
So, yeah, so this is, Shelbyville is not the only place, but it is one. Frankfurt has completed the process and has memorials installed for the 2 lynchings that occurred there, both of which I was reminded of in the scene with the bridge, the lynching on the bridge, because that was what occurred there. And then in Eastern Kentucky, I can't remember the county, there's an effort underway, a slow-moving effort underway to do some recognition. So those are the 3, besides this powerful work in Russellville, which isn't directly connected to the Equal Justice Initiative, as
they are certainly doing,
but they are doing
yeah,
equivalent of, more than, and powerful. So those are the ones that I'm aware of, and I think there is the possibility here in Northern Kentucky for this to happen. It is a challenging thing to be passionate about, because it is not a single person project, and it is not a single identity project. As a white person, I have certain responsibilities to take action in response to this, but I also have certain responsibilities to not lead and get out in front of the leadership of Black people. So that is a nuanced process.
And I think we're probably running out of time, but I think your question, it sounded to me like you were also asking, how did that come to be in Shelbyville? I don't know that we would know the direct answer, but I think how we're exploring how do we make that happen, and how you can incrementally make an impact and an inroad into the community discussion to get people to support this. That doesn't mean everybody has to show up. It just means that we're trying to put it out there so people understand that this is a healing thing and a good thing for the community.
That's right.
And in some ways, I wanted to add just really quickly, there's a dangerous element to this. I remember I was doing this kind of work recently, and I got death threats online. And so for people of color and white allies, really, there's a dangerous element. I mean, think about January 6th and the violent people that were looking for Mike Pence and Nancy Pelosi to kill them. And there are people that are saying if their party does not win the election, that they will start a civil war. And so there's a risk I wanted to put out there, a real risk in this country for that element. Not that we have to be afraid, but we just have to be aware of that. Yeah.
And we also don't like bullies. On that note, I think we're running out of time, but I wondered if we could put the slide up with the QR codes, because there's so much more that we could talk about, and I'm sorry we don't have more time to do that. But we do have information for anybody who would like to learn more about this project. Joetta also has a Facebook page that she just started. I don't know why we didn't do that earlier, but it's there now. So
Boone County, Kentucky Remembrance Project.
Boone County KY Remembrance Project. And please don't hesitate to contact the Archive and History Center in Boone County. We do a lot of this work. I'm happy to answer anyone's question or email. I have cards with me if you would like them.
I have cards. You all have cards, right?
And I'm sorry that we don't have more time because this is some great comments and questions. But again, I just wanted to thank our panelists so much for their knowledge and their time. And I want to thank the Northern Kentucky Forum and NKU and WKU PBS and you all online and here for supporting this effort. I hope to hear from you and talk to you some more in the future.
Thank you.